Market to Market is everywhere you are. Subscribe to Market on YouTube, find us on the PBS video app to stream on demand, and add our 3 podcasts on your favorite podcasting app.
Hey everybody, it's Paul Yeager, and this is the MTOM Show podcast, a production of Iowa PBS and the Market to Market TV show. Hit me up with any feedback, paul.yeager@iowapbs.org. We thank you for your support. Rate, like, review, share, but most importantly, listen. Today we're talking about the weather and how it impacts South Dakota wheat growers. We're going to get also into the different types of wheat grown in South Dakota and trade issues, weather issues, and other factors facing farmers in the state of South Dakota. Reid Christopherson is the executive director of the South Dakota Wheat Commission. He'll explain what that commission is, what they do to help wheat farmers, and what they're doing right now as they look to the skies and make decisions about what they're going to do with the winter crop that's about 40 days from being ready to go into the field. So that's today's discussion on the MTOM Show podcast. So Reid, you tell me if I listen close enough, I might hear some rumble of motorcycles. Is it that time of year for Sturgis already?
It is that time of the year. It officially kicks off on Saturday with certainly a week of high intensity attendance from a lot of great people from throughout the United States. But we've been seeing the motorcycles for a strong week ahead of the actual rally, and they'll continue for a week after as some people take advantage of kind of that shoulder tourism period.
If you live east of your state, traveling on I-90 across to go to, say, the Black Hills and to see Mount Rushmore and things like that, we all get a good look at your state. And it's like the I-80 type corridor, but it's I-90 instead. Is that a fair depiction of South Dakota?
It really is. And in fact, maybe it's just a little bit too populated. If you went just a few miles north and were to take Highway 34 across the state, you would probably be intrigued by how many towns or cities you would encounter on that journey. So the interstate obviously has kind of picked up on some of the major communities. They've kind of maintained their viability because of the interstate. So we've got some wide open spaces, and we love it because of that.
Are you a native of the state?
I am, born and raised.
Where at?
The Sioux Falls area. So.
Okay. And you're in Pierre today?
I am. I'm in the office of the South Dakota Wheat Commission in Pierre.
And that, kind of give me a little lowdown of what that agency is. If it's an agency, it is a commission. So tell me what that means in the state of South Dakota.
Well, much like any other state, the ag commodities typically have 2 parallel organizations that represent their interest. One would be more of a grower organization. The parallel one would be checkoff that helps to manage the producer investment back into the commodity. So within South Dakota, we have an independent South Dakota Wheat Incorporated for the growers, and we have the South Dakota Wheat Commission for the checkoff. It's managed by 5 wheat farmers, commissioners that are appointed by the governor of South Dakota. And I'm fortunate that they have the authority to hire a full-time executive director to work on their behalf and to work in that capacity.
Is it mostly in-state work that you're doing, or are there some flights to Washington, D.C.?
Oh, definitely. There's a significant amount of travel. Of course, like everyone else during the COVID period, it has been changed. But recently just spent about a week and a half in North Dakota as part of the Wheat Quality Council's Hard Red Spring Wheat Tour. And then earlier than that was up there for a meeting of the board of the Northern Crops Institute. But earlier was in Nashville for a meeting of the U.S. Wheat Associates. And so between the multiple organizations that we invest in, there tends to be a significant amount of travel nationally and once in a while even internationally.
What's the feeling among the wheat folks right now?
Well, within South Dakota, it's certainly kind of a trying time. We're seeing certainly a transition. I came into the position as executive director 7 years ago, and at that time, we'd had about 3 million acres of wheat in the state of South Dakota, the 3rd largest of the commodities, of course, behind corn and soybeans. Today, if you were to look at the wheat acreage, it's probably about 1 million to 1.5 million acres. And I often only half-jokingly kind of mention that we're starting to look more like Iowa all the time. Certainly, we're seeing the expansion of corn and soybeans into the western portions of the state where we wouldn't have seen them before. Certainly a tribute to the genetics that have come along with those crops. And also, of course, the value-added opportunity with processing facilities for ethanol and soy oil, soy yeast oil, etc.
But for those that have stayed behind with wheat acres, has the less competition in the wheat arena benefited the others, or how does that balance work among those that are still growing wheat and maybe there's just not as much coming out, so maybe there's a little more demand for the product?
That's kind of part of the story. Part of it is that certainly those producers still invest in wheat. It's a significant part of their rotation philosophy. They see the tremendous value of wheat in that rotation and the impact upon soil health. But wheat is very much a global commodity. So what happens in the U.S. is pretty secondary. What's happening in Australia and Canada and Russia, many other places. It's just this year, everybody is seeing some rather stressful conditions with weather. And so we're seeing some price impact because of that.
Well, let's go into weather then. If I look at the drought monitor that came out the morning that we are conducting this interview, I see a pocket of about, I don't know, that looks maybe 60 square miles, 50 square miles in extreme southwestern part of the state that's not in drought. But there's a lot in extreme, a lot in severe, a lot in moderate. Is that an accurate depiction of what's going on weather-wise for you?
It certainly is. And it's not just the map of this week. It's the map that really has reflected this entire growing season. And so as we look at both the decreased amount of precipitation and also the extreme heat that came along with that during vital growing periods, it certainly took its toll upon wheat conditions.
Is any amount of rain going to save the spring crop?
Spring crop is probably approaching 3/4 harvested. There was certainly a significant number of acres that were abandoned. So at this point in time, I hate to say it, but any rain now would only complicate the harvest and potentially reduce what quality of wheat is there. But certainly important to note that there's no one in South Dakota that is just a wheat producer. And so they've got a vital interest in other crops, whether it's millet or sunflowers, pulse or soybeans, alfalfa, corn. We still need the rain. The biggest impact on the rain now would be that we're really only about 45 days away from planting winter wheat once again, starting in September. And the majority of the state of South Dakota is either about 85% short or very short on moisture at this time.
And so that would, I'm guessing by listening to what you just said, it sounds like there'd be producers who are thinking about, maybe I don't do winter wheat this year because it's just too dry?
It's a possibility that they're certainly going to look at that. Again, for those where it's in their rotation, there's certainly those old philosophies of plant in the dust, the bends will bust. But I tell you what, some well-timed rains in late August and spring wheat is finished would certainly help to finish off a soybean crop, help that corn. It would do wonders for the optimism for seeding of winter wheat.
Optimism. So the South Dakota farmer has that too?
Evidently, yes. Just like everyone else, they're next year people, and they're in this for the long haul. It's not about this year's crop, this year's harvest. It's about those 40 harvests that they might experience in their years as a producer, and it's in it for the long haul. Every decision they need to make, especially as we come into soil health decisions and rotation, become very impactful upon the future.
But the drought is not necessarily a new phenomenon in South Dakota. I mean, Elaine Cubb is an analyst of ours, and she is a producer in South Dakota as well. And she had sent us video last year, and maybe it was even 2 years ago already. Are you in some type of dry pattern that's extended for multi-years?
We're certainly in a changing environmental cycle, and they'll come and they'll go. It's hard to believe that the absolute best wheat this year in these drought conditions was the wheat that was planted on the prevent plant acres from last year that got too much moisture. And so it's continuous. You're always looking at it. We just hope that we might return to something that resembles normal for temperature and precipitation. But I've certainly heard some climatologists predict that maybe there's still some tougher days ahead.
What do you do? What are you telling those? I mean, you've got 5 farmer board of directors there, and what's the message to a producer from coast to coast there?
Well, certainly you make good, solid decisions. Diversification of your operation, taking care of your assets, managing your expenses, being cautious about expansion perhaps in these tough times. But again, you need to be looking ahead to next year with an optimism, or you shouldn't be in farming.
Back to the optimism part. Genetics has developed in the corn and soybean arena. Tell me about the genetic changes in wheat that helps it be able to withstand drier or wetter conditions. What's the involvement been on the genetic side?
Probably the big difference with wheat and some of the other crops is, of course, wheat at this time is predominantly a food crop, has not taken advantage of some of the genetic modification. We are looking at things that might be genetically engineered that would speed up what would happen in a normal mutation or a normal transition, but there's not an introduction of genes from another plant species. The other thing with wheat is it's still very much a public commodity, whereas the corn and soybean crops transition very early to the hybrids and into the commercial companies. Wheat is still very much in the public domain. There are some strong companies out there that do produce commercial wheat, but certainly South Dakota State University, with both its spring wheat breeder and its hard red winter wheat breeder, are still producing the varieties that see the most planted acres in South Dakota.
Is that so? That research done in South Dakota for South Dakota by South Dakota State?
It is, and certainly there's always a value as it crosses borders. We'll see, new rapidly developing genetics, maybe out of North Dakota or Minnesota, that will be impactful on our spring wheat acres, and in a similar fashion, maybe some of the Nebraska varieties that would have application in the southern portions of South Dakota for winter wheat. So, although there is certainly a friendly competition, at the end of the day, we're in it to look for the strongest wheats available. There's also a sharing of genetics within those public breeding programs, and to take advantage of whether it be a drought tolerance, a straw height, straw strength, the disease resistance, protein, etc.
Well, I guess I probably dived in too deep early. Give me the layout of South Dakota and what's percentages of say the spring, say the winter, say the hard red. I mean, what's the makeup there?
Typically, South Dakota is almost evenly split between hard red winter wheat in the south, hard red spring wheat in the north. You can almost draw a line across Interstate 90 or perhaps along Highway 14 that would go through Brookings. There's probably a 100-mile band across the center of the state where you'll see some producers growing both spring or winter, and maybe rotating between the two. But certainly as you get into the southern extreme or the northern extreme, you're going to see a preponderance of one, either winter in the south, spring in the north.
And has it always been that way?
Typically so. Certainly if you went back a few years, you would have also seen the presence of Durum Wheat in South Dakota. That has very quickly kind of moved to the northwest. Again, perhaps as we've seen some climatological shifts, and even North Dakota has kind of seen that shift as well. So Durum has all but disappeared from South Dakota. We had a small period where we saw some interest and growth in some of the hard white wheats, and but due to probably challenges within the elevator system and handling one more line of wheat or class of wheat, we're pretty much back to red winter or red spring.
What's the best time of year to drive through and see the wheat crop? Is it when it's harvested, when it's planted, when it's right before harvest? What's your favorite?
Well, it's always beautiful. And, I love to certainly drive across the state in late fall as everything else is turning brown. And the only thing that's green out there is the winter wheat that is starting to put on that first 8, 10, 12 inches of growth before it goes dormant for the winter. It's fun in the spring, and it's one of the earliest crops to obviously come back to life. It's, of course, cool season grass. It's wonderful to see it as it's growing, to see the filling of the heads, but certainly those great golden fields of wheat waving. Then as the combines come in and start to take it off, it's always fun to see wheat grow.
I know people who listen and watch this podcast like to travel and they like to experience some of the places. If I'm going into South Dakota, give me a couple of good spots that I can really experience what you were just talking about seeing some of those great browns and golden areas and some of those green areas. Like, what time of year do I go where to get a good view of things?
Probably as a person would go across I-90 headed west, you won't see just too much wheat growing until you probably get to Mitchell or Highway 281 and then move west of there. And then it'll continue out to about the Badlands. Otherwise, from Nebraska to North Dakota, it's pretty consistent. It's certainly intermixed with other pastures and forage opportunities. Northeast South Dakota still has a strong presence of wheat. And so it varies really with just exactly what's happening in that region at that time, that producer rotations.
The producer is of many commodities have been watching the news when it comes to trade. What's the biggest trade story that impacts South Dakota wheat producers?
One of the key outlays of finance that come in through the checkoff is into market development. Our largest remains with South Dakota State University for research, the development of new varieties, and for the development of resistance and disease, etc. But market development is next, and for that, it's done in collaboration with about 17 other states and our membership in U.S. Wheat Associates, where we work together to tell the story to the world of the value of U.S. wheat. There's certainly probably two major groupings of wheat in the world. There's cheap wheat, and it certainly has a lesser milling value. There are some countries that will still continue to pursue that. It matches both their cash availability and also the types of products that they make. But for the countries that are the discerning consumers, have an ever-growing taste for wheat and maybe a more Western diet, we strongly believe that U.S. wheat is what they want to be purchasing. You have the best milling value for them, the highest nutritional value, and we work hard to place it in their organizations.
Globally, the thing that's different than, say, corn or soybeans is that where wheat is produced in the Black Sea region. There's the Egyptian, there's the Australian. You got different regions of the world. Is that who the South Dakota wheat farmer is competing? Those markets, are they competing against growers in those regions, or who is seen as competition for your product?
Well, we'll certainly see some price variability within the U.S. domestic market. At any given time, somebody's maybe having a drought, somebody's having good conditions, bad conditions. I would strongly say that probably most of South Dakota's wheat probably stays within the domestic mill market in the United States. But if our spring wheat to the north doesn't have a market with export like North Dakota to the Pacific Northwest, or if our winter wheat in the south doesn't have an export opportunity with Kansas through the Gulf, then we certainly feel that impact as well. But for the most part, as a person watches the markets, the wheat price is probably a stronger reflection upon what's happening with global availability, global surplus, and certainly the strength of the U.S. dollar impacts it greatly as well.
Is there any country that is becoming more of a friend to U.S. wheat?
Well, we work very closely with certainly Japan and China, Malaysia. They have a strong desire for the soft white wheats that might be exported through the Pacific Northwest. Nigeria, interestingly enough, has an extremely strong demand for U.S. wheat, and also certainly Mexico.
And it's always trying to find new places too, or build on existing relationships and expand those?
Combination of both. U.S. Wheat Associates has a presence in 15 countries throughout the world with offices that are out there working local importation, and also in some cases with hands-on baking schools and technology centers to help demonstrate the value of U.S. wheat.
Let's circle back to weather one more time, just in the sense of how it impacts trade. You mentioned there are some areas that may have dry conditions, and that's where someone who has rain might be able to fill that void. Is that kind of the way, is that a new dance that trade and weather and exports and growing seasons is always kind of done?
Oh, absolutely. I think the impact of weather and the impact of markets is as old as the markets themselves. And certainly it's something that's monitored very closely. Just prior to us joining this interview now, I signed off early from a call with the representation of the other 17 states in the United States. We looked at the final reports for hard red winter wheat harvest in the United States. And we, on a weekly basis, explore what's happening with harvest and the activity and the movement from Texas to Oklahoma to Kansas, Nebraska, and throughout all of the region. What are they seeing? What are they seeing moisture? What are they seeing for harvest results, yields? What's the demand? What's the price? So it's all watched very closely, very interlocked.
Which of the on the Board of Trade contract are you looking at mostly? The Minneapolis contract, the Chicago? Which one?
The Chicago, although is typically a soft red wheat, or excuse me, a hard red wheat contract, and not really largely grown in South Dakota, probably is still the market that somewhat defines some of the trends. And so certainly it's watched very closely. But the Kansas City market certainly dictates what's happening with our winter wheat trade and the Minneapolis exchange with the spring wheat.
I think there's many people that just don't fully understand how there's the difference between all these products, and it can be county by county, city by city basis, and how it changes from one producer to another, what's grown and what matters. So sometimes, we talk about what's my 40 acres look like. I know what my fields look like, but the field across the road, completely different. That's not necessarily my competition. Is that right?
That's true. And I think, we certainly watch what happens with some of our row crop commodities, and it tends to trade as number two, and this is the price, and although there's weather impacts. But I think most of our consumers and many producers fail to understand that there are 6 different classes of wheat, and each of those wheat is uniquely different. The hardest of those wheats is Durum, grown in North Dakota and much more so into Canada, used for the hard semolina flour, for hard pasta, lasagna noodles. The next is, of course, our spring wheat, 14% protein. It's the source for your pizza doughs and your bagels, the things that need a dense type of a crust or a dense dough structure. Winter wheat, the king of the bread wheats, and 12% protein. When it falls a little bit short, they may need to blend some spring in there to bring it up to milling specifications. The soft red wheats, grown more to the east, that's the source for your cake mixes and your cookies. And then as we get into the soft white wheats in the Pacific Northwest, actually very discriminatory against high protein. It's desired to be low. Your egg noodles, your sponge cakes, a large Asian interest. And then you've got white wheats as the 6th class that can tend to cross several of those uses.
When did you know and learn all of that?
Probably the day before I interviewed for this job.
So no, you didn't grow up on a wheat farm or grow up with wheat in the blood?
I did not. I did not have the opportunity to grow up in a farm operation. My dad was unable to return to the farm just because of farm size. I always had a desire in agriculture, wished that I could go there. thought maybe the answer for somebody like me was pre-veterinary studies, and really they didn't have a good understanding as an urban background of what was available in agri-industry. Eventually pursued and completed a master's in animal science. And by training, I'm actually a livestock nutritionist with a specialization in swine. But the ag economy in the 80s kind of impacted a lot of us, maybe coming into that era. And I had joined the military while in high school, so went back to a full-time military setting. Finally, I retired from the military under just short of 40 years of military service, and then came to the Wheat Commission.
You bring up a couple of things I want to go back to. One is the nutritional feed of the animals. That's sometimes a discussion point that we use on the show about, maybe corn gets to be too expensive and wheat gets fed. Is there any discussion you have with nutritionists as a whole about, hey, this product will work in a feed mix?
It's out there. It's probably not as commonly used in South Dakota because so much of our operation here is probably more of a cow-calf complex, and those feeder cattle are shipped off for finishing someplace else. So where we really see it kind of come to light is the feedlots in southwest Kansas, where they're monitoring that very closely. In fact, it's interesting at the level to which wheat is being replaced by corn in their crop rotations. But those feedlots are watching that value from a nutritional standpoint of corn versus wheat on a daily basis, very freely going back and forth. Certainly as we get into a wheat crop that maybe for some reason is suffering from a deficiency in value in some case, then feed value is probably the remaining outlet.
And then the other thing you said is the 80s and the way it changed. And that's actually, Reid, how we connected. An episode before, Albert Sparky Duro was my banker. I had a conversation with him, and I asked him a lot of questions about the 80s. You have a connection to Sparky, and it's through, as we found out with Sparky, a lot of organizations. But for you, it's the Boy Scouts. How did you two connect?
Well, we found out over time that Sparky and I have a lot of common interests, both as veterans, both of our interest in community service, our interest in agricultural history. But we first connected through the Boy Scouts, and I had the opportunity to work with Sparky on some national jamboree opportunities, and we'll very freely say that it's because of Sparky taking a chance on me as a young scouting volunteer and inviting me into some rather challenging positions of leadership that anything I probably have attained with service in the years that followed is a direct reflection upon Sparky's investment in me.
Well, make a pitch for what the Boy Scouts, why it matters to be a Boy Scout to help you in life.
Well, for me, Boy Scouts really defined everything about my life. I've been now either a scout myself or a scouting volunteer for about 53 years. I've served on everything from the very local Cub Scout pack to the national committees, and it just shaped everything about me. It gave me a structure for life. It helped to shape my values, shape who my friends were, who I became associated with, and there just is not an aspect of my life that was not in some way touched by the Boy Scouts of America.
Let's finish with this. The biggest story that a South Dakota wheat producer is going to have in the next 12 months is what?
Decisions. Certainly they're going to have to look at what's coming ahead for current drought, moisture, making those decisions. If they do go ahead with planting, then what variety, what planting date, what type of a initial fertilizer, what type of initial spray treatments. Everything about farming on a day-to-day basis is decisions, and it's just mind-boggling how many they make on a daily basis. Everything they touch involves a decision, and they certainly have a significant economic impact upon their life, and also certainly an impact upon their mental and physical health.
The mental health is important. Is there anything that the Commission's done to help the mental health side of farmers?
We have partnered with different organizations within South Dakota, both within the Extension Service and within some of the private health systems, to help spread the word about the resources that are out there for farm families and ranchers. families to reach out and ask for that help and to help identify those symptoms and those signs, what they're going through. Probably most importantly, let them know they're not alone. There are many, many, many other families, their neighbors that are going through the same thing, and take advantage of the resources that are there.
It's an issue that it's always been there, but now thankfully we're talking about it a little bit more, and that hopefully is helping. All right.
Try to remove the stigma.
Yep, exactly. All right. Reid Christopherson, I appreciate it. Are you hopping on a motorcycle this afternoon and heading to Sturgis?
A motorcycle for me. I had one. I sold it several years back. I'll just jump in the truck and going to head across the state, though, and watch the motorcycles drive to Sturgis.
It'll be fun. All right, Reid, thank you so much for the time. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Pleasure to visit with you.
My thanks to Reid Christopherson for that insight when it comes to the Boy Scouts as well as all things wheat in South Dakota. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you next time. New episodes each and every Tuesday, available wherever you get your podcasts or our YouTube channel.